Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Mark Morley, and I'm delighted to be hosting another webinar for the Good Governance Academy. It's wonderful to see so many of our regular guests register for this event, but we also have a number of newcomers today. So while we wait for those to join, I'll share some Zoom tips for those not familiar with this platform. If you can't see the control panel at the bottom of your screen, please press the ALT on your keyboard. That will give you access to the chat box, the question box, and the reaction buttons. Please feel free to applaud or hit a thumbs up during the discussion. If you have any questions during the event, can I ask that you pop these in the question box, not the comment box, so that I can ask these either during or at the end of this session. You are, however, welcome to use the chat box to share your thoughts and also let us know where you're dialing in from. I hope it's somewhere warmer and drier than Cape Town today. For those not familiar with the Good Governance Academy, we're a non-profit organisation that was established by Professor Mervyn King back in 2019. We collaborate with organisations all around the world to educate and empower leaders from all types of organisations, large and small, public and private, and everywhere in between. We run regular webinars to raise awareness of issues that matter. And if you'd like to see what we have coming up, please head over to our events page, which I'll share a link to in the chat window below. I'd also encourage you to join our mailing list, follow us on LinkedIn, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel to ensure that you never miss out. In addition to the webinars, we host Colloquia twice a year. Our 13th event, which looked at optimizing governance, where regulation and deregulation align, was held on the 15th of May, and you can see a recording of that over on our YouTube channel. We also run showcase events to promote courses which the Academy has endorsed. These courses are those which address a broad range of governance-based topics and provide users with current and relevant content. Our next showcase will feature a course from the Barnard Institute in Canada, which is a responsible AI program for boards and the C-suite. But on to today's webinar, and I'm delighted to be joined by Carolynn Chalmers, the CEO of the Good Governance Academy and one of the leading voices on governance. Carolynn was instrumental in the development of the ISO 37000 standard, and she led the development of the standard that we'll be looking at today, ISO 37004. So Carolynn, thank you for joining me today. I'm excited to share this groundbreaking standard with our community. Can I hand over to you for an introduction before we take a look at how organisations can measure and ultimately improve their governance?
Great. Thank you, Mark. Yes, as you said, I've been involved in governance for many years now. I really cut my governance teeth doing what most people are advised not to do, and that's sitting on 52 boards. And really, it was a special purpose issue, and it was around an investment holdings company that was doing turnarounds and acquisitions. And for that, I really learnt how to govern and actively direct from the board. I wasn't a manager or an executive of any of these entities, but what I had to do is ensure that these entities, we were doing turnaround, so the operations and the IT really improved. So it was a mergers and acquisitions kinds of transactions. So trying to tell organizations what to do and direct them and overseeing, that they are doing the right things, not necessarily in the right way. They would know better than I do. But that really is where my governance journey started. And that was, I'd hesitate to say how many years ago, Mark. So quite a few years ago.
Nice. So do you have, can you take us through the ISO standard that you've been developing? And then
I'll do that.
As questions pop up, I can direct those at you. We can also save some questions for the end. So I'm sure
Brilliant.
people are always shy and like to wait until the end of these things. So
sure. I'm happy to take questions whenever. Let me share my presentation. So I will share the presentation to the as a PDF for download on the website as well, on the event page, Mark. So this standard that I'm going to be talking about today is really the reason why I got so involved and was driving this in terms of the measuring and assessing governance was recently, a couple of years ago, we did a series of governance around the world at the GGA. So you can go and have a look at those events. And we looked at governance in various jurisdictions. And that was as a result of the work that I was doing with 37,000. It was actually having a look at aggregating and understanding what governance was being done around the world. But part of that was understanding, so if these are, what right looks like, or what good looks like, how do you know when somebody's doing that, when an organization is doing that? And as it came out of South Africa's corporate governance code, the King reports, the King 4 came out with this understanding of a governance outcome. So what good looks like is a governance outcome. And then in asking and engaging with these governing bodies and these regulators and institutes of directors that had created these codes, ask them, so how do you know when it's being well governed? Well, you look at the outcomes. But then when I look at their board assessments and they do their governance assessments and their evaluations of boards, there was nothing around that. There were no questions about outcomes. And so really, this is why I'm passionate about understanding what the world has to offer in terms of what to measure when it comes to governance and boards of directors, and of those measurements, what actually matters for an organization so that they can perform well according to whatever codes of governance or whatever fiduciary duties are prevalent in your jurisdiction. And this standard that this is a second in the series, but the standard is called 37004, and it was published in October 2023. So we're getting up to 2 years now that it's been around. And the reason why I asked the Good Governance Academy to do this series was really to bring this to light. I find that many of the institutes of directors and the large advisory firms, the audit firms, etc., that are doing governance assessments, doing board assessments, are not looking at the outcomes, and they're really just looking at, are you doing this? Are you doing this? I like to use the integrated reporting framework. For those who are not familiar with it, now, if you go to the IFRS Foundation, the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, if you go to the IFRS, and you Google integrated reporting, in the framework is this diagram of inputs, business model, outputs, and then outcomes. And I think most management practitioners work with inputs, business models, outputs, and outcomes. And even if you're a manager, you understand that having somebody sitting at a desk for the 8 hours of the day doesn't, that's the input, doesn't give you a document that you can use or an output that you can use. So the output is then what comes out of that input, and you must measure the outputs. But actually, what's the net result of that? Did that work have an impact? And that's the outcomes. And what I find that most institutes of directors in their governance assessments or their board evaluations, and even the big audit firms, etc., advisory firms that are doing evaluations, are still looking at input. And even perhaps a little bit of output. Did you attend the board meetings? Did you attend the committee meetings? Did the committees meet? That's all input stuff. The output is, do you have a terms of reference? Do you have your minutes? That's all output kind of stuff. But the outcomes is what makes a difference. So this standard here is the only international guidance that is available on assessing governance, and it is a maturity model. And the maturity model it gives you a point in time, but the reason why internationally the first model that came out was on the basis of maturity is that as boards we meet 4-6 times a year. This is not a fast-moving environment. Governance is not, breakneck speed. This, governance improvements happen over years. Our 4 meetings a year are jam-packed with all sorts of things about the governing the business. And very rarely do we set aside time to understand the business of governing. We're so busy governing the business, we don't focus on the business of governing. And so it can take even longer. So governance maturity is about, this is where you are today, but really what we're more interested in is where you're going to and how you're going to get there. because the point in time just gives you a point in time and okay, yay, yippee. So really what we need to do is be able to compare, contrast, improve, and it's really that over time, how are you improving from where you are today? And what does improving look like? The last webinar we had was really around why this matters. And why this matters is really gave 6 ideas around it. Is accountability, is, you write examinations. And what is that? Is to make sure that you bank that information. And if somebody's measuring you and you understand that you're being measured, it brings a little bit more accountability for your actions. So really it's about that. The results build credibility and confidence. So we say we are measuring ourselves. We want to know how we're improving, and we want to use information to be able to improve, not just, we feel that, it's a dysfunctional board. Speaking of which, Prof. King is going to talk to us about dysfunctional boards on Thursday. So I'm really looking forward to that. Then strategic decision making. The fish rots from the head, as Bob Garrett said in his book. And if we don't have our thoughts and we're not in tune with our business of governing, then it filters through to the governing the business. And so strategic decision making, really, if we can improve our ability to make those decisions, obviously what you have to measure to know to improve. So it does drive it through to improvement. If we can prioritize, we can optimize our inputs. So, for example, if you're running out of capacity as a board, it's not only about setting up another board meeting to carry on the discussion, but perhaps you should be looking at your board packs and optimizing those so that you don't spend all your time discussing the managerial issues and really you're making strategic decisions. So there are different ways of doing things. And so identifying that is a problem, you can start now understanding and unpacking that optimization opportunities. And then, of course, your risk. If you're not looking at certain things, if you're running out of time, it does pose to a risk to the entire organization. We've seen what happens when you don't govern well, when you do have these the CEOs are going off and doing their thing, and you don't actually have the time to sit down and debate and deliberate effectively on the matters that count. And of course, then you start getting risk starts introducing. So that's just a whistle stop, Mark. I thought it was worthwhile, for those who haven't seen the previous webinar. But what we're speaking about today is these governance maturity aspects. There are 4 real key areas in the standard. The first webinar was around why are we doing this anyway? There's a little bit of why are we doing it. But in the standard itself, it talks about these maturity aspects, or essentially the aspects that we're going to measure. So that's why I thought the title of this webinar, Measuring What Matters, it really talks to this. There's 3 other areas, and that's actually how you go about measuring, what the various levels are, and then how do you go about improving, and what do you do, how do you prioritize, etc. So today's webinar really is talking about these. What are we measuring?
I think that's it's obviously a really important point to start at, because I think the first thing that measurement does is it highlights everything that needs to be done, which kind of sounds obvious, but there are kind of things to be done that just aren't on people's radar. So when you have your measurement in place, you've got listed everything out. It makes people, it raises awareness of things that before it hadn't, people weren't even aware of them. So I think that's the first key thing about measuring things, is it just puts everything important on the table.
Absolutely, because otherwise you don't have sight of it. So, and even if you're measuring the wrong things, just the act of measuring, as you say, very important. So as I mentioned in the beginning, really, and it came out of South Africa, and most governance codes now have an approach that looks at governance outcomes. And it's not the governance outcomes that the board is trying to achieve or the governing body is trying to achieve. It's what is the net result of the good governance of the organization. How does that impact, because we're looking at impacts, the organization? And so it's what should those impacts be? How should the organization behave when it's being well governed? I'm going to use ISO 37000 because it's internationally applicable. In fact, it's the only international standard that applies to all sizes and types of organizations, no matter where they're incorporated. So that applies to everybody online. Of course, you'll have your own governance codes in your countries, you could do, but this is the international benchmark of what good governance looks like. And there, 37,000 talks about governance outcomes. In fact, this standard, 37,004, uses 37,000 as a basis to provide its descriptions of things. But it equally says it doesn't have to be 37,000. It could be whatever code or standard that you're using. So it does give you governance outcomes like most codes do. It also gives you governance principles. And those governance principles are, most codes have principles. Some, like Sarbanes-Oxley in the United States, have practices that it's mandated. And then those principles are provided or supported with key aspects of governance practice. Now, importantly, those key aspects are not what you must do, but what you should consider when you're applying those principles. What are the things that you should be looking at to apply the principles? Interestingly, and many codes around the world in governance, they incorporate things like the governing bodies or the board should be competent. They should evaluate their performance. They should, use committees where appropriate. And 37,000 considers those as the conditions for good governance. So those are the conditions within which, these principles should be applied. And so although they're not principles in their own right, they are very much part of the governance of the organization. So I'll use this framework and I'll explain it a little bit more so that we can understand how to measure. So this is the diagram of ISO 37000 that really shows us the principles, and then I'll go into the conditions. But to start off, just to show that the outer band is really all of the activities that happen in the inside. What the organization, after all of these activities are happening, what we want is for the organization itself to demonstrate its effective performance. So it's doing what it's set out to do. It's achieving its targets. It is, when it's achieving its targets and it's performing well, it's doing so ethically. And that was in developing the standard, we spoke about the mafia test. We had people in the room who are representatives of the arms industries, etc. So the arms industries, even though you might not, subscribe to what they're manufacturing, you can say that they're performing well and they're behaving ethically according to their values. They are manufacturing the arms with good governance around it. But the mafia test is that even though your mafia scenario is performing well, you're using collusion, corruption, and all sorts of unethical behaviors. So we also always spoke about the mafia test. So the organization should be performing well. And when it performs well, it should be doing so, practicing ethical behavior. And the organization itself should also then, obviously, it's using resources, not only its own resources and capitals, but those of the community and goodwill and, the natural environment, etc. So the other thing is that we want them to perform well, not profit at all costs, but with good, responsible stewardship. A stewardship of your relationships with your stakeholders, with the natural environment, etc. So when we're assessing governance, actually, it's not so much about the governing body themselves. It's about the outcomes, the net result. Is the organization performing well, when it performs well, does so ethically and with responsible stewardship of its resources and the resources that it's using? So if you wanted to assess governance, you didn't need to look at the governing body at all. You just ask the stakeholders internal and external stakeholders, do you believe that the organization is behaving this way? So I think for many people, that's quite a mind shift. Just do a survey. If the organization is behaving well, according to these 3 governance outcomes, then you can be quite sure that you haven't got fundamental issues in the governance of the organization.
It definitely seems that there are many organizations that struggle to make that connection with what they do and how they govern and how they operate internally with the impact that they're having on the environment, on stakeholders. And so that's the critical thing here. And that's where you go from a compliance tick box mentality to where we're at.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Mark. And if I just go down now into the principles themselves, ISO 37000 puts at the very heart of its governance principles the purpose of the organization. Then it has 4 foundational governance principles. Now, these are based on governance theory from Peter Day in Canada, John Carver in the US, and nonprofits and purpose governance, purpose governance. And then you've got Bob Garrett and Bob Tricker and even Mervyn King. So those theoreticians around governance and quite practical guidance as well all talk about 4 aspects, and whether it's policy and then strategy, or it's strategy and then policy, it's oversight and accountability. The one difference that ISO 37000 has put in is it's really, before you even get to strategy, understand, and this is really driving the stakeholder inclusivity model, understand what value you're generating for which stakeholders before you even get to understand, co-create the strategy with the organization. So that's why it looks a little bit different from the other, guidance that we've had to date. But this is really fit for the 21st century. It's future fit. Because now this is really embedding in stakeholder inclusivity, which again is a concept that came out of South Africa. And South Africa was leading in this specific matter because it was a very, very new democracy in the scheme of things. So when it created its governance codes, the King Code or King Report 1, King 1, it had just moved into democracy. So the concept of creating value for stakeholders and inclusivity of stakeholder considerations, legitimate needs, wants, and expectations, as Prof. King always says, it was in the forefront. Now, it's been quite a few years later. So what was that? That was in 1994. So 2025. 2021, when this came out, value generation now has finally become a principle. We still don't see that in most governance codes. We see the need for stakeholder engagement, but this value generation is really fundamental to this standard. And then we've got 6 enabling that enable those 4 things to happen. And as I mentioned, stakeholder engagement, ethical and effective leadership, data and decision making, risk governance, and then 2 sustainability principles around social responsibility and then double materiality. So those are the principles, and just a whistle stop around. If you read 37004 and you hear about the principles and practices, it's really around this. This is an example of some of the practices that ISO 37000 provides. So if the principle around purpose, and I chose purpose specifically because it's the primary principle, so to speak. So the principle is that, the governing body should ensure that, and principles start with should, because if you state it as a matter of fact, then it's more as a directive as opposed to a principle. So principles should always have the term should in them. Should ensure that the organization's reason for existence is clearly defined as the organizational purpose. But moving to the key aspects of practice, they provide it in 3 areas. One is practices around the defining this organizational purpose. It says you should have it clearly defined. So let's have some practices around how to go about defining that. It also says that an associated set of organizational values is clearly defined. Well, then you need the practices around how do you go about doing that, defining the organizational values. And then it's a concept about commitment. It's all very well you having the values and the purpose, but you need to commit to it. So there's another set of practices. And again, these are key aspects of practice. They're not required. And the King reports, King 4, for example, these practices are not required. They're recommended. And you take these practices and you apply them as is appropriate for your organization. So I do want to, and I know we almost halfway in, and we haven't spoken about the 3 governance aspects, but the governance conditions is quite important, because this is generally in many codes is either, well, it's codes or it's in law. These governance conditions tend to be buried. So I just wanted to call them out, because when you're assessing governance, you should also assess these before you even get to principles. You're assessing the conditions within which the principles can flourish. So if we think about, you have all the ingredients for the cake, but if you don't have an oven that's working, well, you don't bake your cake. So these are essentially the conditions. So first of all, it has a couple of conditions. First of all, it's about governance and delegation. So it gives guidance in terms of you really need to have effective delegation and be able to delegate effectively, because, well, if the organization isn't aware of what you're trying to instill in the integrated governance of the organization, well, what's the point? So if you're not delegating effectively, what's the point of even trying to apply principles? Understanding the difference between governing and managing. Governing, I always use Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker said, governance, leadership is about doing the right things, and management is about doing those things right, in the right way. So for me, governance is about the why and the what of the right things. And management is all about the how. By the time you get to governing, myself, I was a programmer. In those days, I was called a programmer, but nowadays they call them coders of all sorts of things. So I was a programmer. Don't ask me to code in Python or any of these new fancy fangled languages. I'm appointing people and I'm delegating to them to code. But, these youngsters, I also need to have some boundaries in terms of what are the right things to do when they're coding. Make sure that you're maintaining security and privacy of information and various things. So that's a board's role, really, around, the governing is about the right things and management is about the right way. So if you don't have that clearly defined, in fact, it makes your application of principles really difficult, and you start getting upward delegation from management to the board. And then you start getting an ineffectual governance from the board into management. So it's really an important condition. We spoke about stakeholders and stakeholder inclusivity and ensure that you get fair treatment. We're busy writing a new governance standard, Mark. Between 2 and 4 in the morning, I've got nothing to do. So a new governance standard on the governance maturity for groups of organizations, specifically, the controlled groups like a holding company and subsidiary. And there, the treatment of the subsidiary organizations as a stakeholder is coming through quite an important consideration. Sustainability, we spoke about that. And if you haven't got that embedded in, your thinking, as your governance thinking, that you are acting in the best interest of this organization and the generation of value over the longer term, then it doesn't matter about all of your principles. But then that sustainability aligns very closely with the purpose principle that I just showed. If your purpose is a special purpose vehicle, of course, then your sustainability timeframes become reduced. If it's a 50-year deal or if it's a 5-year tax structure, your sustainability over the 5 years, etc., becomes, or 50 years becomes your time frame, your long term. Finally, there's another section in 37,000 that does talk to all of this other stuff, the composition, the structure, the competence, and that's really making sure that you have the right people around the table. I always say that your nominations committee, or how you nominate people to the board, is probably one of the most deciding factors when it comes to governance, because if you are nominating people that have skills that aren't appropriate for the organization, have a representative agenda and not acting in the best interest of this organization, for example, a government appointee and this is a state-owned entity, but all they bring is the governance policy, the government policy, the political parties policy, and not actively acting in the best interest of the organization, you're going to have some problems. So all of these things together make the governance conditions. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time because when we assess governance, the three aspects that I'm going to talk about, it's not just the practices. So the new King 5 draft has come out with this template that you can fill in your principles and your practices, and then apparently everybody will know how you're performing and they'll be able to read it and understand how you're doing it. Well, actually, that template is just giving you the inputs and a little bit of outputs. The practices give you a little bit of outputs. It tells you nothing about the outcome. It tells you nothing in terms of how the organization is actually performing against those inputs and outputs, what the outcome is going to be. So, you might be ticking the box everywhere, but is it actually making a difference? So let's look at what the key aspects that shape these outcomes, that really drive the outcomes. And these are the governance maturity aspects. There are three of them. The first thing is good governance needs good behavior. So if you are opening the pack as you walk into your boardroom, if you are arguing just for the sake of arguing, if you're not considering the matter at hand, if you're not behaving well, it's not going to work. If with kids, Mark, if they're having a tantrum on the floor in the middle of the shopping center, it's not going to go well. So we need to behave well when we're governing. And that's sometimes we get this behavior assessed, do you feel you're having a say in the boardroom? All of these kind of cultural questions are asked in board evaluations, but we need to understand more than just, are you behaving well? So we'll look at that. Then the effectiveness. Now, with, as I said, the King 5 draft, they're basically putting these are all the principles and these are the practices, and now explain why you're not applying those practices. Well, that makes them required practices, doesn't it? As opposed to recommended practices. What we want for mindful and purposeful governance, for our boards to be doing their best. So let's just get that right. Compliance is the minimum acceptable social norm. Anything less than compliance, you get fined, you get put into jail, there are penalties. Governance is about more than that. It's about doing your best. So our governance codes are about helping us do our best. Now, we want the best from our organizations, and we want the best from the governing bodies that are governing these organizations. And our best is that they think, they apply their intellectual capital. They are mindful and purposeful when they're governing the organization. They are, as you go onto the soccer pitch or you go into any kind of exercise, you are mindful and purposeful when you're doing something. And so we don't just want a list of here are your principles, and these are the practices that have already been provided. And yes, we're applying all of those practices. Nothing mindful in that. What it is these are the principles, and how are you applying the practices, and why are those practices appropriate for your organization? And as I say, that's talking about principles here and practices, but it could also be these conditions and the outcomes. And then finally, efficiency. Now, if you send auditors in to audit your governance, if they've got an audit mindset, they're going to ask you questions on a compliance basis, like we have in the United States. And there's lots of papers written about how over time there's been so much spent in complying with Sarbanes-Oxley, and what is the net result? Well, not very much. That's because it's it's very, very efficient system, but they're not tend to achieve the outcomes. Now, there is a place for efficiency. So if you have an organization of 5 people, that's great. Everybody knows around the table. You don't need to have a code of ethics and a code of conduct because you're speaking to each other every day. But if you've got 150,000 people, you really do need some communication, some engagement around what does it mean in this organization to behave ethically?
Yeah.
What does it mean to conduct yourself appropriately? So those are the three aspects that we are measuring. Are there any questions, perhaps if I take a pause now?
We did have a couple of questions actually. There's one from Rob. I'm just going to find it here. And actually, on the last slide, we were talking about stakeholders. So Rob's question was stakeholder inclusivity. What does this look like in large companies? Only select interactions with selected targeted stakeholders, or does it embrace the opportunity for any stakeholder on any day at any time to engage through any platform, digital and social, on any issue important to them?
A really great question. So technology is certainly helping us get to that point where if an organization could publish their corporate information as a data lake and open it for query by a large language model, we would have any stakeholder ask any question at any time. So we are getting there. But where we are today is where it's really stakeholders live with the governing body and in consultation with management, is we need to identify all the stakeholders that could possibly, and a stakeholder means have an impact or be impacted by. Society is not a stakeholder per se, but it's certainly treated as a key influencer. So we do tend to treat society generally and communities as stakeholders. And then there's an exercise that we go through to understand. We group our stakeholders in terms of their legitimate, not just any kind of legitimate needs, wants, and expectations. Then we look at those and we take a risk approach and we understand which are the relevant stakeholders for the governance of this organization. All of that should be transparent. It should be available in the corporate information to say that we are engaging with these are our relevant stakeholders, and these are our relevant stakeholder groups. And then this is how we engage with them. But that's just in terms of engagement. Stakeholder inclusivity means that we consider those stakeholders when we're making decisions. Now, if as a stakeholder we're not seen on the radar, we can legitimately make a fuss and say we are a stakeholder, and we can start making a noise around that organization, be it through annual general meetings or through shareholder activism if you're a shareholder, or stakeholder activism if you are a stakeholder that hasn't been recognized. But really it's about engaging, but also then bringing it into the decision making. So I hope that answers Rob's question. Sound right?
Thanks, Karen.
Okay.
And then we have another question here on a more general theme.
Sure.
What are the key challenges organizations might face in implementing ISO 37000, and how can they be addressed? And then also, does 37000 account for different types and sizes of industry and company?
So I'll start with the second one because I can't remember the first one. I have to say the first one again. But the second one, yes, it's all sizes, all types of organizations, no matter where they're incorporated. So it is a one-size-fits-all model. Then that becomes really important. You need to take that model and see how it fits to your organization. And then you use 37004 to see if you have made that fit appropriately. If it does fit your organization. What was the first question again? How do you go about applying?
What really are the key challenges in implementing ISO 37000?
Let's get to the maturity aspects, because it's actually those. It's buy-in, it's intent, it's that mindful and purposeful approach. Certainly, I've seen a huge uptick in the international standard as opposed to the local standards for multinational organizations. The local standard absolutely has to be a priority for the local operation. But to try and explain to an international organization. Oh no, you might have Sarbanes-Oxley, or that you are requiring.
I think we've lost you, Carolynn. I think we've lost Carolynn. If you can just bear with us a few moments, we'll try and get her back. Okay, Carolynn's just dialing back in. Just bear with us a few moments, please. Can I just remind everyone, if you do have any questions, I see there's a number in the comment section, but if you could pop them in the question box, that just makes it easier for me to see them and track them, and we can just make sure that they all get answered. For those that are in the comment section, I'll make sure that they're pulled out. Carolynn's just rejoining now. We will also just let you know at the end of this session, we'll share a copy of the slides with everyone. So everyone that registered, whether they're able to attend or not, will get a copy of the slides. The recording of this will be available on YouTube, and also the answers to the questions. We'll make sure that they're noted, that they're registered in the emails that we send out to everyone, so you can see the questions that people are asking, and the answers to them. Welcome back.
Thank you. That was a pain. I'm on my phone now, so hopefully that works.
Wonderful.
Sorry. So
No problem.
thanks, Mark. I'm going to take just be quick now with the next. But I was talking about the 3 governance aspects. So apologies, everybody. I'm really glad to be back now. The first one is on behavior, and here we look at a learning organization. So this is a behavior towards learning and improving. And if some people, the educators on the call will recognize that this is the Bloom's taxonomy, or the Bloom hierarchy of learning. When we send our kids to school, they just bang out the 2 times table, then it's all about remember, remember, remember. As they get older, it's about understanding and being able to describe and discuss and explain. And then it's the application of that knowledge in theses, and being able to, in your degree and your postgraduate, and analyze. And these are just the different levels of learning. And these have been applied in terms of looking at international best practice on governance behavior. These then are applied to governance behavior. If we have a look at the very lowest level in terms of remember, this is about just adopting. And it always talks about principles, but it's not only the principles. We must remember the conditions as well. So adopting, it's the adoption of governance principles and governance practices and governance conditions for good governance. It's just the very first level is about the case of adopting. Then it's about understanding them. It's then applying those principles in practice. Then it's about analyzing how those principles have been applied. So actually just conducting one of these studies is taking you to a level of analysis. To do a 37,004 analysis of your governance behavior, of your governance practice, it actually leaves you at that level of good governance. Evaluating then, you've got your analysis and you're comparing with other leading practice, and you actually evaluate what do those, those answers mean. And then finally, improving, because what we want from our governance and our governance behavior is not to sit in a boardroom and open your pack and govern the business, but actually improve the board's ability, the board's business of governing as a board to continually improve. We want our organizations to do more with less all the time. More profits, more employee satisfaction, more customer satisfaction, less money available, less resources available. But we don't do the same for ourselves as a governing body. So this gives an indication of what governance behavior should look like when it's improving. The second aspect is looking at this effectiveness. We spoke a little bit about this now, and what does it mean to select and implement appropriate practices. So this is about taking those key aspects of practice, the recommended practice, what's available in good practice around the world in 37,000 and others. What we need to be able to do is provide a clear statement of the governance principle, condition or outcome or whatever it is that we're assessing. We need to be able to provide a clear statement of that principle. At the very basic level, can you remember what the principle says? Isn't that the fundamental of a behavior level 101? Can you recall what it says around risk governance? What does it say? What is the statement around risk governance? Should govern the organization's risk well. Is that all it says? We remember that under purpose it wasn't only organizational purpose, we also need to define values. We also need to make sure that our purpose talks about the natural environment and society. Very, very basic level 101, we need to be able to recall these principles, not necessarily practices, but certainly the principles, the conditions, governance and management, governance and sustainability, governance and delegation, or the outcome, responsible stewardship, ethical behavior, effective performance, should be able to recite those as 101, the lowest level. Then we should be able to say why this principle is important for us. So again, I go back to that King 5 template, the drafts template. There's nothing in there where there's any input from the governing body or the board to say, there's the principle. Why are we doing this? Why is this important for the organization? We don't know. King Code says it, and we comply with the King Code. Is that mindful or is that mindless? That's ticking the box. And then finally, we should be able to explain how we are applying that principle and why we are applying that principle. So some principles might not be appropriate for us. Some governance outcomes might not be appropriate for us. Some conditions, perhaps we are a special purpose vehicle and we only need to be there for 5 years. Really, what practices are we using? Is that really important? And it becomes very, very streamlined and narrow. It doesn't mean you don't need governance to do your best, but it certainly becomes very streamlined. So governance effectiveness looks at your mindful and purposeful application of this guidance, and you understand why you're applying it. So here we're looking at...
Sorry, Carolyn, but it goes back to the right at the very start when Professor King was asked to put the code together, and he was at pains to say, we will not legislate this. I don't want people following this mindlessly. And it would be a shame if in King 5 that approach leads people to take that behavior, because he went to such pains to make sure that wasn't the case.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And many people say, lots of people I speak to about, that template in the King 5 draft. Oh, fantastic. Best thing that could ever happen. Yes, it makes your life easier because you have no cognitive thinking to produce that table. And what does it mean to your stakeholders that you're able to regurgitate something and push a button and generate it?
Yeah.
It means nothing to stakeholders, really. So where's your mindfulness, Mark? You're absolutely right. So if we get to this mindful and purposeful application of these principles and conditions and various things, first of all, there's no evidence that you actually have adopted anything. Then maybe it's in draft, and maybe you're looking at, well, it's incomplete, and I would say that that publishing that King 5 draft template is incomplete. It's just inputs, pushing the button, here it is, no think. And I see that often. If you look at the reports of listed companies on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and if you look at them carefully under their governance disclosures, generally in the integrated report, you will often come across something that says, well, in King 3, and we've been in King 4 for the last 7 years or whatever it was at the time. So it is just this complete mindless push of the button. Then if we look at the inconsistent, you're trying, but you're not quite there. So it's inconsistent. And then it's consistent, but you're not actually measuring your application. You're just taking the practices, you are applying the practices, but you're not measuring if those practices are doing anything. Are they achieving anything? Are they having any impact in terms of what you're looking for? And then are you actually measuring the impact? Are you reporting on those impacts? And then are you doing anything with that information? Are you actually looking to improve? So we looked at the behavior, which is really around the learning organization and ability to build into your DNA. When you're making decisions, you're able to just recall these things because you don't want to think about the 2 times table. You don't want to think about, the principles that you're trying to apply. You're just applying them. It needs to be in your DNA. But then you also, when you are applying these, what practices are you using? Have you got committees doing this? What are the committees supposed to do? What are the terms of reference? And so you're really looking at continually improving the way that you're applying these principles. The last one is around the efficiency. Now, this is, as I said, this is the one the auditors always go to because this is where it becomes explicit. So here we've got components. You have got a governance framework. It's a drawing. And in fact, 37,000 spoke about governance frameworks, but didn't provide any guidance on what a governance framework is. 37,004, I'll show you on the next slide, provides you what a governance framework should contain in its basic level. Obviously, you need to apply this again to your circumstances. So the framework really just provides clarity. In the old days, I remember my dad used to speak about, oh, it's a diagram on the back of a cigarette box. Because in those days, do you remember those cigarettes? Don't have that anymore. The vapes are all in plastic. Can't draw on the back of those.
No.
Then we've got strategies, governance strategies. So not just strategies, the strategy for the organization, but our approach to achieve outcomes when we are governing the business. So our governance strategies. Then we have our governance policies, which provide parameters for the organization's strategy. So these are where we articulate, these are the right things to be done. And, then we go and say, and these are the people who are going to go and do them. And then those people or committees or infrastructure or systems that are going to go and do them need to give us performance results. Because one of the components of the delegation is that you can't abdicate. You delegate, but don't abdicate. You're always accountable, even though you've delegated responsibilities. So to remain accountable, we get reports back and we check that things are being done in the right way, and we apply our minds to that. So this is the performance results with policies. And then we've got the charters, which are really the detailed descriptions of terms of reference, the board charter, the committee terms of reference, a role, job description for the CEO, for the CFO, so the various governance roles in the organization. And then we're looking for management reports back from them. Now, the management reports, these are more qualitative in nature because we're giving this to people and we don't want regurgitated facts back at us. We also, if we're applying our minds purposefully to practices, etc., we also want them to apply their minds to what it is that we've asked them to do. So we want their insights. We're not there day to day, so we want to get their insights. Okay, I said I would give you a governance framework. It is in the slide deck that I'll share on the event page. So here is a very, very basic governance framework. I know in South Africa, we have a chap that is registered and patented a corporate governance framework. It's not that. So yes, he might have registered this corporate governance framework, but that is not what international best practice looks like. A governance framework, it has been agreed internationally, unanimously adopted, that in its basic form, this is what a governance framework should have in place. I thought it was, even though this is from the standard itself, I thought it's important to give us some guidance in terms of what the governance framework should contain. And then without the communication, if we go into the communication of these frameworks now, we get, if you've got these red traffic lights and you've got the green traffic lights and you have pedestrian crossings, you just get a mess and everybody goes everywhere. If you don't actually communicate what it is that you're intending, you don't get the impact and the results, the outcomes that you are wanting. So I remember, soccer matches when the kids were young, it was the kids just, they're like bees around a flower, they just follow the ball and they follow the ball because there are no rules and they might have been communicated, but they certainly weren't recalled. So we need to recall these rules. We need to apply these rules. We need to have them actively in our DNA. So first of all, actually, you haven't done anything. You haven't drafted them. You haven't thought about them. You don't know what these right things are, what these governance components are, what the strategy is, the policies, the framework. You don't have any job descriptions. Now, for some organizations, when it's a sole proprietor and it's their own business, they may feel that that's actually not necessary to sit down and think about where they're going as a business. Most people do, even as individuals. Where do I want to go? What is my next step? But maybe you don't want to. The next thing is really that it exists, but it's sparse. And maybe that's actually okay for an organization of 5 plumbers. You all get together, you're doing really well, you get referral business from each other, and you're operating collectively as an organization and, don't really need these. So I'm not saying you have to have this. I'm saying what is appropriate for your organization. Sometimes lacking means that it's there, but it's not there, and there are components that are lacking. Typo there. It is in place, but they're not being reviewed. So this is, where's your HR policy on, I don't know, maternity leave? Well, it's there under let's bring the brush out, the duster out, and here it is. It's sitting in some minute book over there from years ago. I'll go into the safe and pull it out. It was adopted and it was done, but it was ticked off, but we actually haven't really looked at it for many, many years. And then you actually have things that, are reviewed, they're measured. We need to make sure that those practices are being applied. The strategy, the governance strategy is being followed. It needs to be refreshed. It needs to be revised because it's not doing what it's doing. It needs to do, and then of course we're innovating. So you could see how the levels of maturity that we'll talk about in the next webinar really come to the fore, where the 3 governance aspects, and you can't just measure them once off. Are we behaving? Are we applying principles? Are we communicating the principles? Those are yes, no kinds of questions, and that can give you an answer. And you can go back to your stakeholders and you can report in your integrated report. Yes, we are behaving well. Yes, we are applying principles in practice. Here's our King 5 draft template. And yes, we are we're communicating through our terms of reference and our minutes, and it's all being communicated. But you can understand by looking at these things that there's a lot more to it, and those are the levels of maturity. So our next webinar is on the 21st of August, and here we're going to be talking about the levels, Mark, but I just want to leave this is the QR code to the standard.
Oh, perfect.
And I know we're right on the hour because I've dropped
Yes.
off.
So we did have some questions. I know we're at the top of the hour now. I've saved the questions. So I thought maybe we can answer them offline, Carolyn. And then it saves
Perfect.
rushing through them, and we can give some decent answers. So all of those questions will be answered, and we'll share those with the presentation on the page on the website. So yeah, that's all we've got time for. So thank you, Carolyn, for taking us through that. As we've known for a long time now, what you can't measure, you can't improve. And as governance is such a critical topic, there's no question that we need to ensure our actions are leading to the desired outcome. So, as I say, we'll share a summary of today's webinar on the LinkedIn page, and the full recording will be on the YouTube channel. So be sure to follow both to ensure you don't miss out. Thank you to you again, Carolyn, for taking us through that. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate it and hope you took something away. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share them with us. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.